I'm so excited today to be joined in conversations that life science leaders aren't having by Dr. Waqaas Al-Siddiq. Waqaas is a serial entrepreneur, an investment advisor, and an expert in wireless communication technology. And presently, he is the CEO and founder of Biotricity. Biotricity is a modern medical technology company focused on delivering innovative and remote biometric monitoring solutions in the medical and the consumer markets. I'm so excited to welcome you, Waqaas, into this conversation. So welcome, Waqaas. I am really excited for us to spend a little bit of time together and dive below the surface. So I provided that short bio of you and Biotricity. I would love for you to share a little something out of your life that folks couldn't find on your LinkedIn profile, but has really shaped who you are and who you are in the world.
Thank you, Jeff. I think, and glad to be here. And I think that environment shapes us a lot, right? And some of like meaningful experiences. So I can maybe talk to some of the unique experiences that I've had in my life. And I think that they, to this day, make an impact in terms of my thinking. So, I grew up in Winnipeg, Canada, a small town, born and raised there, and then spent the formative part of my years in Seattle, Washington, because we moved from Canada when I was 12. But my how I grew up, I think, really does shape you. And I was very outdoors, right? In not really a video gamer, not really sitting inside. I was always outdoors, always biking, hiking. Building, snow forts, playing hockey, playing sports. And so I was always a very analog person growing up, which is very interesting, I think, because I'm a very digital person as in terms of my career and what I chose to do and how I became an engineer. So I always liked the idea of building things. And originally I wanted to be an architect, and I quickly switched to an engineer. But this was from a very early age, from like second or third grade. This was my thought process. And I think that analog oriented childhood makes me look at things very differently when I'm looking at technology. So I think that is one big part of my background. And people don't necessarily think of me. I mean, you think about engineers, you think about people who were into gaming when they were growing up. You're thinking about, growing up in cities and coding when they were young. And that was not at all who I was. Which I think is definitely something that shapes me, but it's also something that nobody would necessarily guess. And I think the second part of my experience is, a lot of people don't know this about me, but I went to university very young, when I was 14 years old. And so, I went through puberty in my junior year of university, right? So how people view you, how I am as a person. I always, when I could grow facial hair, I started growing facial hair because I wanted to look older, right? And to this day now, I can't remember the last time I did not have a beard or some sort of goatee or something. So these are elements that certainly shape who I am and shape my personality, but also give me, I think, unique perspectives because, again, going through university and not being part of cliques in high school and stuff like that, because during that time I was surrounded by intellectuals, by people who are thinking, that has really shaped who I am and how I think. So those are two, I think, things that if I go back into my life and I say, hey, what makes has made an impression in my life, those are two experiences that I think were very critical to me becoming who I am today.
Mm. And in these conversations with CEOs like you, we always try to bring stuff to street level, and so you could pull from either the outdoorsy dynamic or the second example of going to university very young. What's the evidence, positive or negative, but what's the evidence of those experiences on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis as you lead your company?
So I can talk about, we talk a lot about diversity right nowadays. There's a big topic around diversity, and hiring people, because there's this issue around not hiring, and giving people opportunities. And so this I find very interesting because having grown up basically in a university environment, I only understand merit. it was never about gender or perspectives on life or political positions or race or anything like that. It was about, can you do something? Are you aggressive? So for me and within the organization, Biotricity has never been that organization. It was always based on merit and initiative, right? And we always value somebody who takes initiative, even if it's not their experience. We will run alongside those people, even though if there's somebody who's better experienced or maybe better suited for the job from a resume perspective, but the person who takes initiative and wants to learn is far more valuable to us as a company. And so we've never really looked at that. And inclusivity has just been a natural, because I think from my experience, I never really experienced that, because at such a young age, it was always, in a university environment, it's always about what is your idea or what is your thought, and what is your reasoning behind that thought. And so this idea of groups and not being inclusive was never something that I really experienced at a really young age. And because I didn't experience at a young age, from a day-to-day perspective, we have this conversation going on about, especially nowadays, about your hiring practices and things like that. And does everybody have the opportunity for any position? And by my own nature, Biotricity's always been like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I am fascinated by how our childhoods shape who we are in the world today. So I'm fascinated by that, hearing your story, knowing my own story. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I am curious. The title of the series is Conversations That Leaders Aren't Having. So whether you draw upon what you just shared or something new comes into your mind, what's the first thing that does come into your mind when you hear me say that phrase, conversations that leaders aren't having?
So I think that, leaders and my perspective, of course it's, I always preface everything based on my experience and what I'm doing and how I'm doing. And I think that, conversations that we aren't having as leaders is really understanding, critically our gaps in terms of, both internalizing and also looking at our teams. I think we get into these programs, or we get into these comfort zones, and we're not willing, I shouldn't say we're not willing, but we're not critically looking at it, right? And so, what I say is that, in a team, there's different flavors of CEOs, right? There are product CEOs, there are finance CEOs, there are operational CEOs, there are strategic CEOs, and I'm really a product CEO, right? And so what ends up happening is, as a product CEO, I have to understand that, hey, I'm not a specialist on the finance side, so I need to make sure that my team fills those gaps where I'm weak in, right? And nobody can be a jack of all trades, right? And operationally, I can do operations, but that's really not my forte. So again, I need somebody on the operational side. So I think that these critical conversations between you and your team members are not being done as much as they should be. And that's where what you'll find is, in certain organizations, you'll find an overlap, right? You have a CEO who's an operational oriented guy, and then you have a superstar operations guy. Well, that's not going to flow, because you've doubled up on a skill set that was already strong. Yes. So, that critical aspect of looking at yourself and looking at what are the gaps on your team, I think that's happening less, and it should happen more.
Yeah. What it really speaks to me as I'm listening to you is the courage of self-awareness. Because there's this image of a CEO out there in the world of she or he is the end all be all, the classic, Hollywood CEO. But what you're really talking about is, well, what's the reality? And my sense is it really requires courage to have that level of self-awareness, and then to take it one more step and the humility to say, I am not the jack of all. I don't have it all figured out. And so I'm wondering whether it's in yourself or in CEOs that you have advised over the years, is how do you get to that level of, first, self-awareness, and then second, the humility to put that into action?
Yeah, so I think that is that's always a challenge for everybody, right? And you have to really kind of take a step back and think about, I always try to think of it as the office of the CEO as opposed to me as a person, but the office, right? What does the office need to accomplish? What can the office do? What does the team need to accomplish? And try to look at it that way. And also recognize at the same time that, like you were saying, that there's this idea of what a CEO is and an idea of what an entrepreneur is. Entrepreneurship is like chewing glass. I've said this before. It is a level of intensity that not everybody appreciates. I mean, and I shouldn't say, that I think people look at the successes. They don't look at the road that takes to get that success. It's not about traveling and seeing the world and eating at dinners and things like that. It's the reality is more like, I have 15 problems going on. I have to finish those problems. I have to travel to a conference. I have to arrive at that conference. I have time to take a shower and have a bunch of meetings, a lack of sleep. And what ends up happening also, and I think this goes back to conversations that leaders are not having, is that the people you recruit, for your first level team, they have to operate at that level of intensity. And are we clear to people that we hire and saying that, listen, because it creates a pressure for them as well, because they see that, hey, if you've got a CEO that is a founder or is aggressive and is intense like that, you're creating that intensity around those people, right? So while you create that intensity, you need people to have that intensity, because there's no off switch. You have to really love what you do. When you're sleeping, you have to be thinking about it. And that's why I try to think about it, like I said, as the office, because that helps me think about critically what the office needs, as opposed to me as an individual, and try to be and try to have that humility to understand, hey, I am only filling a piece of that office, and the office and the team have to deliver more. But but if you take that back and you say, hey, okay, I've created this intensity, I've created all of this individuals that have come in. You also have to be open to their ideas, and yet you have to balance that with your sheer confidence, right? And it's almost borderline arrogance, but sheer confidence that what you're doing is 100% correct, because there's no room for doubt in your mind, and yet you have to be open to ideas. Like, that's complicated.
Yeah, I've recently read Patrick Lencioni's his most recent fable called The Motive, and the subtitle of the book is I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't remember it exactly, but how so many leaders, especially executive level leaders, have forgotten their most important job. And I think you're really pointing to that there is a job of just sitting in the seat or the office of chief executive officer. And yeah, that person may have some expertise in operations or product or technology, but there's some fundamental responsibilities around just being in that seat. And you're pointing to one of those most important is ensuring that you recruit and build a team of the smartest people and like-minded people that you possibly can.
Exactly right. And I think that, when you do that, you have to be you have to also let them know what they're getting into, right? Because there's a lot of times you bring in smart people and they're like, well, I didn't sign up for this. And the reality is, at a certain stage, it is intense. And you have to create that intensity. And some people are for that and some people aren't for that, right? And that's totally okay. But you need the type of people that operate in that way, because otherwise it doesn't work as a team, because you're like, well, I recruited you to do this, but you didn't set your expectations correctly. So you really can't hold them responsible. And then you get this animosity because you're like, hey, I'm putting in whatever 70, 80 hours a week, and this person clocks out at 5 o'clock. But it's many times these are not jobs that have an off switch. The C-suite there is no off switch. And this is the problem, right? At least at a certain level, right? And then I think as you get to a certain size, there's more flexibility. But even then, there are moments in time that, you have financial reporting, you have investor conferences, you're trying to raise capital. Like, there is no off switch in that case. And so, to create that level of intensity, to recruit people and let them thrive. And the interesting thing there, which I always find, is this dichotomy, right? Of, I just mentioned it earlier, is the CEO has to be so laser focused and confident in what their direction is, right? and to the point of almost arrogance, and to the point of almost like nobody can convince them otherwise, and yet be able to turn that off the moment they see or somebody provides a better idea, like an off switch, like instantaneously. And to put that in one person's mind and to hold those two aspects, because they're contradictory, right? How can you be so confident and yet completely open to change in ideas?
Yeah. And again, the word or the phrase that's coming back for me is this depth of self-awareness. And I'm really appreciating, as I'm listening to Waqaas, is how deep that needs to go. It doesn't always go there that deep, but how important it is to get to that depth of self-awareness to do the thing that you just described of being able to hold a position, but then also back away when there's a more compelling idea. I'm curious for you, what was the on-ramp, or what was the superhighway maybe for developing that level of self-awareness?
I think for me, what happened is it goes back to maybe a little bit of what I was talking about earlier about, when I started university really young. So I always had a disconnect with many peers, right? So I gravitated towards having friends that were older and more experienced, because the way I process things logically, I was always able to like get to the outcome, right? And what the experienced individuals and people who had been there, done it before, always taught me is that it was actually not, it was counterintuitive. It was not something you could think through, because there was a variable or something that only experience would show you. And so as soon as I kind of reconcile that component, that not everything can be just thought out, right, in a vacuum, then what ends up happening is I started surrounding myself with people, and of course I enjoy, and I always enjoyed, because I'm a avid reader. I love knowledge. I'm always interested in soaking up new ideas. I always pick friends from different areas, right? So my friends were never, I have my engineering friends, but in generally, like I like friends from philosophy, friends from architecture, friends from business, friends from finance, friends from economics, friends from different areas of disciplines, and because I'm getting a shortcut to their knowledge, right? And then on top of that, adding the experience component of it made me realize that, look, you if you can recruit people and you can find people with experience, they can shortcut things for you, because they'll give you all the variables that you have not thought of. And so that was kind of my fast track, or my superhighway, if you will, to getting to that awareness, because it was very clear that, hey, you can sit and think through all of this stuff. Like I can build a financial model, even though I'm not a finance guy, right? And I can build operational supply chains, even though I'm not an operational supply chain guy, because I can read and I'm an avid reader and I can soak information. But at the end of the day, there's a bunch of hidden variables there that until you've done it, you won't really know. And those, in cases when you miss that, or you don't see it, or you're having a discussion with somebody and talking through that, and they said, oh, what about this? And you're like, oh, well, that's different. I would have never, and immediately it's like a reality check. You're like, there's no way I would have figured that out until I would have been 3-4 months deep into this thing, right? And so that was my approach into getting into this type of thinking.
Yeah, it feels like as I'm listening to you, there was this notion, very not just notion, but the practice of being a student. So that I'm sensing maybe still has followed you today is, and not just student of information and of concepts, but student to learn what somebody else has to offer, to really understand their experience and their thinking. Would you say being a learner, being a student has stayed even today as one of your core principles to how you go about life and work?
Yeah, I think, being a student and constantly being a student, I think that's just a normal part of a job, right? And I think in every job, and of course, especially I think in the C-suite, but I think in every job, you're a lifelong student, right? And I think that those things teach you, and you always, that's why we always have those, are we doing those win-loss analysis? Why? How do we not repeat the same mistake that we did? Or we found a variable that was very unique to our business, or something that happened. Like, COVID made everybody learn a bunch of things, right? And so, and I think if we ever forgot that idea, recent events and how things changed was kind of a big lesson or a slap in the face to anybody who thought that, hey, you can stop learning. And the reality is you cannot.
I want to go back to something you were talking about a few minutes ago, and you were speaking about alignment. I don't think you used that word, but alignment in the C-suite, especially with your first team. And I'm wondering, you mentioned the word a level of intensity, but I'm wondering, for you personally, what are the values that you seek to align with your first team, and then maybe even the larger organization?
So for me, when I talk about alignment and intensity, I think, one thing that I'm always trying to position within the broader organization is ownership, right? Ownership and taking initiative are I think the two biggest things that I'm always grappling with, especially in the first layer of management. And you really need people that are going to take ownership and initiative. And when I say ownership, I mean complete ownership of what that task is or what it is that you're trying to accomplish, right? So if you're dealing with manufacturing, you need to own manufacturing completely from every aspect, and you want to and you want to know every nook and cranny of it. And you cannot effectively delegate to your team if you can't do everything yourself. And so that is a big thing. And you can't effectively hire, because you need to hire people that are better than you at it, right? So, and I practice that myself, right? As I said, I can build a financial model, but I'm going to hire somebody who can build a better financial model and do it faster and better and than I can. And so if you can't do everything, then you cannot delegate it correctly. And if you can't do everything, you can't own it correctly, because you don't know what you're missing. And so that ownership and that initiative is very, very critical. And if you don't know something, ownership means you're going to take the interest to go learn it. Yeah. You're going to go sit down and understand, what am I missing? Why did this happen? How do I not repeat mistakes? How do I, status quo is not enough. And that part is always a challenge. And when you're trying to hire people, I think we get relaxed. I think we hire somebody and say, oh, look, the resume looks great. And we hire them. And I think this goes back to another conversation that people are not having. We hire somebody and we're like, okay, their resume is perfect. They look at it, but they're not owners. They're not initiatives. They're not taking the initiative the same way. And you're like, okay, well, maybe that's the industry standard. No, it's not. It can be the industry standard for certain types of organizations. But if you want your organization to operate at a level of intensity that you're trying to maintain, then you need owners. And that means that person will not fit in that culture. And you have to be okay with transitioning people out, right? And maybe you have to transition people out 4 or 5 times until you find the right person for that role. But you have to be okay with that. And you have to plan for that. Because, for me, what I'm trying to do in my culture, if I take something out of the office of the CEO, right? And because office of CEO needs support in finance or operations, and I give it to the finance function, but the finance function does not completely own it, and they're coming back and they're saying, okay, let's do this, then there's no owner. It's split ownership, right? And so that becomes a distraction. So at the end of the day, it's better to keep it and hand it to the right person, because when they're going to take it. And so, and my whole thing is that, and I use these things, is like the 80-20 rule. I know people say 90-10, but I'm saying get it to 80%. My whole idea of ownership is, if you're an owner, you can get it to 80%. The team can get it to 90-95%. So that's the key thing, right? Can you get something to 80%, right? And if push comes to shove, if you have to do it yourself, can you roll up your sleeves and do it yourself? And are you willing to do that? Or are you a delegator? Because if you are a complete delegator, that's not the type of management people that I want. I want hands-on people, not because I want them to be hands-on forever, but when push comes to shove, when they need to, they can do it. And that's I think a critical piece.
Yeah, and you're touching on, again, the theme is conversations that leaders aren't having. One of the ones that I don't think we're having enough, CEOs and senior leaders, is the accountability or the ownership conversation. So take us behind the curtain, maybe give us an example, redacting all names, but an example of a new person who's coming into Biotricity, and you're having the ownership conversation. There's some evidence from their past that they take initiative and ownership. Maybe you ask for a reference, but take us behind the curtain of what's the ownership or the accountability conversation that you're having with that really important hire that you've just, or that you're about to bring on.
Right. And so what I talk about when I'm hiring, and I can talk about a couple different places that I hired. I've hired in sales and I've hired in marketing. And I explain to them that, I like to quantify things, right? I do a quantification of what is going on, right? So what needs to get done? What is what are those itemized lists that have to get done? And what is our plan, right? What is our 30, 60, 90-day plan to accomplish these things? And what are the items and what are the resources? And so, and I've explained to them that, look, I've got a team because that is helping out doing this, but nobody's an owner because they're helping, right? I've got my creative director, I have my assistant. I'm taking help from wherever I can because the box is stuck on in the office of the CEO, right? And so I need somebody to come in and take that box off the shelf and take ownership of it. And so this is how I talk, right? And so this individual came in, and what I found was, 2 weeks. So I give people time, 2 weeks, go learn, understand what it is, etc. But what happens is that they're on email chains and they're not responding. But there are other people that are responding and putting in comments and taking initiative. And when I had the conversation saying, hey, listen, I hired you to engage and deal with this conversation. I understand there's a bunch of players. And the answer is, well, I didn't want to step on toes. I'm still new. Look, if you have a comment that's not relevant or it's a bad comment, that's okay. But at least you're engaged, right? You're supposed to come in and take over something and you're not engaging in the conversation. Even if you're behind, right? I would expect you to engage. Or if you're unsure, you'd say, hey, can we have a conversation about this privately? But it would be opposite. It would not be me asking you, why aren't you engaging? It would be you coming to me and saying, hey, I've been looking at this. I'm not engaging. And here's the reason why. How do you think I should approach it? Because that means in one aspect, you've taken ownership. And in the other aspect, I still have the ownership, and I'm going back to you to try and figure out, hey, are you going to engage? And so that's certainly a challenge, right? Like, you look at somebody and they've owned it, they've been hands-on from a resume perspective, but many times what happens is, especially people don't realize, hiring upper management is very hard because it's very hard to interview for them. You can't really give them a test because how do you give them a test? There's so many different tasks. You can ask them, do they have a team and how much do they do? But at the end of the day, whether they're hands-on or they're a delegator, you will never really know until you hire them and engage with them. And that is something that is a very complicated thing, which I have yet to figure out. And I would love to figure out the manual to hiring upper management. Is where you can bifurcate, hands-on versus non-hands-on people and find the right type of person. But so far what I have found is that it's a process, and you have to be okay with transitioning people out and going on a search, and it's a journey.
Yeah, and it strikes me that there's a role, there's a maybe an unspoken about role for that senior leader, for you as the CEO hiring those individuals, that you have to prove yourself to them that they are empowered. Because we all have a lot of wounds from our past where someone has says we're empowered and we can own it, but they didn't really mean it.
Right.
They didn't really mean it. So it strikes me that it really speaks to, as you're talking about these consistent conversations, that there's a requirement by the CEO or that senior hiring person to prove that they're legitimate when they talk about empowerment and ownership.
Right. No, and that's a good point. And you know, and perhaps that is a conversation that needs to happen. You know, I always think, and maybe this is my mistake, right? That if I've said that you're empowered and you take initiative, you'll very quickly know if I'm lying about it or not, right? So, but if you sit back, then, you know, and I have to prove that after I have hired you for a position and said that you have ownership of it, then, you know, maybe that is something that I have to go through and say, okay, yeah, listen, you know, go and do it. I'm always of the, for right or wrong, I'm always of the thought process that you bring somebody on and you gauge their level of interest, right? And I think that's another component is somebody truly interested? Because to build an organization, you really have to be interested in doing what that organization is doing. Or is it just a job? And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that also. Both are totally fine. There are people who like that it's just a job. They want to do it. And they should have all the power to do that, right? And treat it as just a job. It's just which organizations are set up for that and which organizations are at a different life cycle where it's not that. There are jobs at Biotricity that are just a job. That is what it is. And there's certain roles that are just not that, right? And so I will take your point to heart, and I'll think about it about proving. But I have always thought that, hey, the person who really is interested, like you really have to be interested, right?
Yeah.
They will show up and they will be excited and they will almost, you know, go overboard in their level of interest and try to like get into everything. And you'll see that. And that's the person who is very engaged and they are really like, they're believing and they're living in and thinking this thing. And then the people who are just a job, maybe that's the ones that you have to prove it to them. But to your point, maybe if you prove it to them, they are amazing people. I have just always taken the other road.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had with the CEO who always had this question when she would hire, and she would ask, "Why do you want this job? Why do you want this job?" To gauge what you pointed to, which was interest. Why do you want this job? And behind it is the question, do you want this job for the sake of just having the job? Or do you want the job, what she was driving at, do you want the job because you're really interested in the work and the mission and what we're up to? And I don't think enough people ask those type of questions to gauge how deeply interested is this person, or have they been unemployed for 6 months and they really want or need a job? So I think that you're really pointing to, again, conversations that leaders aren't having is, are you really interested in this?
Right. No, and those are the things that I gauge, right? So I actually asked that, right? And then for each role, I asked them very critically. Or at least I try to, if I'm hiring for marketing, if I'm hiring for sales, right? I'll ask them, you know, if you're trying to sell this product, how would you sell it? Sell it to me. What is your, well, how would you build an effective sales force, right? Or have you, if to understand, did they go to the website? Did they try to understand the product? Or if they're for marketing, what did you think of our marketing? And if they don't have, if their answer's shallow, it means they didn't really study the site. So not only do I ask, why do you want the job? What is your reasoning for this particular position? Why did you leave your last position? But also I try to ask questions to understand how much background information they checked in on, because if they're very interested, what they should have kind of thought about is not only the company and the product, but how they would do it or do it differently. And that just comes naturally for, high level professionals, right? They look at something, they're like, oh yeah, I see that. I see these gaps. This is how I would do it.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. And I love that we're just pulling out these principles all along the way. Again, we're framing it as conversations that leaders aren't having. And you and I could probably talk for a couple hours on this. But with the last question I'd like to ask you is, if you could have a conversation with your younger self, the one before you were leading an organization or leading organizations, if you could pull him aside and have a conversation with him, knowing what you know now, what would that conversation be like? What would you talk to him about?
Very loaded question. I will break that up into, three things, right? First, I would tell them, you need to always, you need to create a sense of urgency. It's very, very critical to create a sense of urgency, that things have to move at a certain pace, and you have to set that pace. And sometimes you forget, but if you don't create that sense of urgency, it really emanates from your office, right? To innovate, to move fast, to keep the speed up. The second thing is understand and not get upset about not making the perfect hire. More often than not, you're not going to make the perfect hire. You will have to go through multiple people, and even then, there is no such thing as a perfect hire. What you have to do is you have to find the right person and work with them to make them the perfect person for the job, right? And that's part of training and things like that. So don't get frustrated because you have to train somebody, or you have to, or it's taking time. What you have to do is you have to find the alignment of personality, intensity, and urgency and ownership. And if you have that, you have the best person that you can. And now you got to work together with them to, get them to do things the way and align with your vision. And so I think that, that is something that I would definitely talk to myself about, and not being afraid of this, hiring, it doesn't work out, hiring another person. It's a journey, it's a process. And what you're really doing is you're trying to look for a personality that is engaged, like you are, and then you have to work with them. There is no such thing as a perfect hire. And the third area that I would really talk about is this concept of parallelization, which I really focus on and I talk about, which is really understanding what things have dependencies and what things do not have dependencies. So sequential versus parallel. And that's a shortcut. It makes you go faster. It helps create, and you can actually put things into buckets and say, oh, okay, look, these things are not dependent on one another, so I can run them in parallel, and I can achieve my goals a little bit faster, because I've actually taken something down and taken the time to break it down and understand what is dependent, or which items are dependent, and what items are not. So those are kind of the three things that I would focus on as a conversation with my younger self.
I can only imagine if he heard those and took them to heart, probably save him a lot of pain and frustration and struggle. But really wise words, and I'm sure will be valuable for those that are listening. Waqaas, this has been a lot of fun. Let's definitely do in the future a part 2 to this. And for those that are watching or listening, and they want to know more about you, where can they find out?
They can, of course, there's a bunch of information about me at biotricity.com. I publish a lot. So we have a Medium where the articles that I talk about are published. And then, of course, I have my Twitter, my LinkedIn, my Instagram. So feel free to follow me there.
Yeah, and we'll put all that in the notes for the show. Again, thanks so much. This is it's been a lot of fun.